lucky for us, or we would have been another several days before we got home. As it was, we were stowed in at the Miller Ranch for 19 days before the Army came through with bulldozers and plowed out the county roads. We were there at that ranch. He had a lot of livestock on feed and bred cows out on the open range. It's a canyon country with a lot of big pines, so there was a lot of shelter. But to talk about snowdrifts, there were saw timber in those canyons that the trees were 30 and 40 feet tall, and those canyons filled up to where the tops of those trees that stuck above the rim of the canyon looked like little Christmas trees. He mentioned something about this snow blowing and freezing. 11 or 12 days after the storm was over, the railroad came through the Miller Ranch, and they hit a frozen horse in a snowdrift and had to go back to Alliance for repairs, and then a couple of days later they came through, and the snow was so crusted that in the deep cuts there on the Miller Ranch, they had men out in front of the big rotary snowplow with poles breaking through the crust so the snow would slide down into the big blade of the railroad rotary snowplow. Otherwise, the snowplow would just go in and it couldn't blow it out because the crusted snow over the top would plug up the discharge pipe. We'd been married several years and had 2 small children. The wind was what made it so terrible. Right from the start of that storm, the wind was terrific and the gusts were terrible. And when it finally quit storming there, 80 to 90% of the ranch was absolutely bare. The snow was all in these humongous drifts. And people talk about buildings being buried. The typical example I saw of that was later when we got started at home. We had to go to Chadron, Nebraska, and then go to Hot Springs and come up through the Black Hills to get to Gillette to get home, because the road that went from Crawford, Nebraska to Lusk, Wyoming didn't get open till about the 10th of May that year. It went right up through the Federal Reserve at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and it must have had tremendous drifts. Well, anyway,
but not much there.
As we left Chadron, Nebraska to head for Hot Springs, South Dakota, the South Dakota Highway Department had just taken the fence down because the highway went right through Ulrich, South Dakota, and they'd just taken the highway fences down, and we just drove around Ulrich, and the snow in that little town of Ulrich was just as deep as the buildings were in the town. They had literally had to tunnel, and all the snow was there. Once we got into the edge of the Black Hills, crossed the Cheyenne River, why then the roads got better the whole way home. But we were snowed in down there for 19 days. And we had a huge root cellar, probably had 50 tons of potatoes in it. They sold commercial potatoes out of their big cave root cellar, and we had plenty of beef, and they had plenty of hay and a hay mow, and there was a truckload of ear corn sitting in the barnyard, and so we had no problems taking care of the livestock that were in close, except we had to be very careful to keep horses and other animals from sheltering up between buildings where the snow eddied, because that eddying snow would freeze over their noses and they would smother. So after a couple of days of the storm, well, we just turned everything that was in the habit of sheltering up around the ranch buildings, we just opened the gates and ran them out. So they wouldn't be in a place where the snow would eddy around and they'd smother, because you realize that any animal that chooses cannot breathe through its mouth. So if their nose freezes over, why they ultimately die. That's ultimately what kills stock in a storm, is that they smother from their noses freezing shut. Heading for Chadron to come north back into Wyoming, somewhere on that road highway, we were running parallel to the Northwestern Railroad, and there was a railroad personnel man there testing the telegraph lines, and he had shoveled down to the top of the pole, and he was standing there reaching down to clip onto the wires that were still buried in the snow, and the wires were below his feet. That's how deep the snow was in that area, and the railroad cut somewhere between Crawford, Nebraska and Chadron, Nebraska, and I have a photograph of that.
Got it.
Okay, Dad covered it very well on the movie there. Pardon?
Pretend you're eating
Okay.
an ice cream cone.
Okay. A couple of things that I remember being 5 years old was that when it was basically on or close to being over, it was a shack house we were in, had a sloping porch that went out. And the door opened out. And it filled that porch up to where it was only about 18 inches up to the roof. And they opened the door, the door opened in, I mean. They opened the door and slid me down there. And I went down over the porch, and then outside the ground was bare. And there was another shed there, tool shed type thing, and I got scoop shovels and stuck them back up through there so they could start shoveling a path to get out of the porch. And the other thing through part of the railroad's snow plowing and work, somehow a deal was made that the landowners or the people living there, they could get on the train as it moved along with gunny sacks and have some coal. And they were running low on coal at my grandparents' house. And so Dad and Grandpa and probably my uncle bagged up, I think 6 or 8 bags of this coal and threw it off as the train moved along. Went back and retrieved it, and that night it was bitter cold. And they built a fire, and they filled the old stove full of coal. But the coal was from Colorado, which was the real hard coal and high BTU. And the stove turned red hot. And I do remember them saying, well, you can't put water on it, it'll ruin the stove. And so I remember everybody had to get dressed in their winter clothes in case we had to leave the house if it caught it on fire. And they had soaked blankets or towels, and they were slapping the wall behind the stove and up above it until the fire burned down enough it was safe that it wasn't going to burn the house out. So that was scary. And then one other thought is in Dad's interview of the people, you drove around the road, the highway, where it was bad by cutting the fence and just driving out through the field and then getting back on the road. And in one spot, the railroad cut was real deep, and I guess I've always liked machinery, because there was an old drag line sitting up on the bank digging the snow out of the cut so they could get the snow plow from the train in. And that's kind of into mine. So
Paul, how old were you?
I'd have been 5.
5.
Yeah.
And so David was only like 3.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was a pretty bundled up little guy.
Little guy, yeah.
And I don't remember much more than that, other than there was a lot of worry and misery.
Yeah, your dad, I don't know if Paul has heard the whole interview that we did with
I had not.
Victor. The interview was actually on KROE radio, so we were on Public Pulse, and there were 3 people that we interviewed, and it was also David Huff and then Marge Halverson. So if any of you know those people, I can share that interview with you, because your dad had a lot more information, but he really does tell a story well, and you can picture it in your mind. And so I really appreciated all the interviews that he did with me. So we'll have to share that with your family. Thanks, Paul.
Okay.
You want to turn on the lights?
Yeah.
Okay. Mona, do you want to come?
Yes.
Now, Mona has a great story because it is in Bighorn.
Do you care?
Well, as long as you didn't say off the record, you know.
I'm glad I heard Dad's name first.
My story isn't near as dramatic as some of this, but my birthday is January 4th, so I was just in the process of turning 8 when my cousin, who was on Hidden Valley at that time, and my dad came down to the school, and I was in the 2nd grade, my brother was in the 1st, and got all of our books and took them home. They knew something was happening, and we weren't able to get home on the road. I remember they had a command car that my cousin had access to of some kind, a military camp command car, and they got us home by cutting some fences, I think, and getting us over a creek of some kind. Got us home with all these books, and I don't remember much about the storm itself. We took our books home, and my mom had been a school teacher, and so we had school for the next 2 weeks where we were snowed in. And then when we finally got back to school, the town kids hadn't done anything. They were waiting for us. And then the kids out Big Goose Way, a bunch of them did not get in for another 2 weeks after we were out. So it must have been pretty bad. Like I say, I don't remember a whole lot about it, but it was, I remember Dad says, get your homework, and so I had this little book, and next thing I know, we've got all our books going. They knew something was coming. So,
Thank you, Mona. You
Yeah.
can just put it on the table.
we must have had, there must have been, nothing was said in any of this about power outages, but I'm thinking there had to have been a lot. No electricity or anything. We didn't have any electricity either, but then we didn't have any electricity anytime, so that didn't bother us any.
Okay.
Next.
Is there anybody else?
Get your last name, please.
I'm gonna try this thing out here. I'm not sure if it's gonna work or not. Let's try that. 1, 2.
Yeah.
Coming out?
Yeah.
Okay. I was involved in a couple of snowstorms. Now, 49, I was 10 years old, and we heard a knock on the door, and it was 2 guys from the highway department. And they were looking for shelter. A similar story to everybody else. And they had entered the cut up there above our place and busted a snow drift out. And then they came across the big snow drift, and they couldn't back up. And it blew in behind them, and so they had to climb out of that cut. Now this is the one just north of Sheridan on the old highway going to Dicker, after you cross the overpass there. And so their truck remained in there throughout for about 3 days. They weren't too unhappy. Mom was a good cook, and we had coal heat and everything else. But we had to accompany the guys up there. We stood on top of the cut. You couldn't hardly tell where it was because it was just all blown over. The only thing sticking out was the 2-way radio aerial. So you could tell where the truck was because they had to signal the rotary plow not to dig their truck up. And then they had to shovel out by hand so they could get to that. So the thing that I noticed with all of the accounts here is how well the telephone lines and telegraph lines seemed to work. The thing that kills that, even though that stuff was under the snow, ice doesn't conduct electricity. So basically, even though the wires were surrounded by snow, it didn't affect the transmission quality of a lot of the telephone lines and stuff. So these people were fortunate that they were able to call each other up and down the lines, especially that book about Nebraska. Wyoming didn't have as much telephone service in 49 as they did in Nebraska. They're talking about the attic filling full of snow. If you go over here and look at our museum, you'll see the wooden shingles. The boards up there are spaced about probably an inch or an inch and a half apart. And you can actually see daylight out. This is the shingles are put on purpose that way, because if wooden shingles get wet, they have to be dried out from underneath. And so there's those air spaces in there. And they're effective. They don't leak as long as the rain falls vertically or nearly vertically. But it didn't take into account the fact that wind blowing at 70 miles an hour can blow under the shingles and go through those gaps and fill up the attic. So that's how a lot of these people ended up with a lot of snow in their house. It wasn't that they were that poorly insulated or sealed or anything else. The roofs necessarily let in all of that because they didn't have asphalt shingles at that time. I've got pictures here, the winter of '84, and I got marooned at the Knudsen Ranch. The interesting aspect of that is right before that storm hit, I stopped at the Knudsen Ranch down on Powder River, and I remarked to Maggie down there, I said, you know, there's some seagulls in your hayfield. And she said, oh no, I got to get a hold of Kenny and get the cows in. I said, what do you mean? She says, every time there's seagulls show up here, we get a bad snowstorm. And no kidding. She says they get out ahead of these storms and they don't want to fly back down through them. So they fly ahead of the storm and they run out of gas in Wyoming. And so if you see seagulls in your hayfield, you better get the cows in. Got one picture here, a pile of cows in a fence corner. The other cows that survived climbed over those cows and fell over the fence and got out of the trap, only to end up on the railroad tracks to get hit by the train.
Oh, God.
And I've got sheep. It shows these sheep here. They swam in the snow over a cut bank and got caught in treetops. After the snow melted, they fell out of the trees. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
I was 17, and I lived in a small town in about a block from the high school. And all I remember about that storm, I don't think we had near the length of it or anything but elsewhere, but I was able to get to the high school, and I was the only one in it. And all day, I was there all day. I was the only one there, and I was the editor of a school newspaper. And so I made it a town newspaper, not just a school newspaper, and told all about the storm and everything. And I printed it all out on a mimeograph machine. I couldn't mail it until later. But anyway, I did the whole thing. And later we got a state award for giving the history of the town in that high school newspaper. So I was kind of proud of that at the time.
Well, I was in the 6th grade at Bighorn, and we lived up toward Little Goose Canyon. In those days, we didn't have school buses. We had Bessie Sackett's Chrysler station wagon. And when that got stuck after this storm started, they got Leroy Sackett's Dodge Power Wagon and rigged up some sort of wooden frame and threw a tarp over it and put the bus kids in the back end of that until the school board said, no, too much danger of carbon monoxide. So my sister and I had 2 weeks vacation before we could get back on the regular bus route. And we had a good time. We weren't sorry at all.
Well, I was just coming on too when that storm hit, so I can't remember much myself. My dad tells the story that, in fact, it's in one of them books too.
Oh, yeah, I
part
think
of
it's in that one. Yeah, it's in the blue one.
Anyway, his brother was in the process of moving to California. So they decided to have a going away dinner at Grandma and Grandpa's. Now there's 6 brothers and one sister, and they were all out there when the storm hit. And I'd have to count them on my fingers, but there was a bunch of little kids about my age and younger. So Grandma, she just started pulling dresser drawers out and stacked all of the little ones in the dresser drawers, and that's where we slept. And I guess everybody else, slept on the floors and what have you, because it was it was a 2-bedroom house, and there was 7, 8 families there. Anyway, about the 4th day, Dad decided he had livestock at home. He had, I think, a half dozen hogs that I can remember him saying, but I don't know how many cows. Anyway, he decided he had to get home to feed them, and that was 12 miles. So the 4th day, he took off afoot, and he made it 5 miles the first day. And he, the people at Tubby Bard was their name, Bard was their last name, but anyway, that's where he stayed that night. And he was happy because he could had some coffee, because the 7 brothers and 6 brothers and 1 sister, they drank all the coffee over at Grandma and Grandpa's. So he had fresh coffee that next morning before he took off, and it was 7 miles from Tubby's to where we lived. And when he got there, of course he was exhausted and, wet and sweating. And first thing he did, went down to the barn to take care of the livestock. Well, the barn was a kind of a dugout. And I'm not sure if all of the walls were built that way, but I know one wall was hay bales stacked with chicken wire over them. And, some uprights and everything. Well, the hogs had pulled all of that chicken wire off, and they were just plumb happy. They had all the hay in the world they wanted. Dad said they were in better shape than he was when they got there. So that's
Great.
I lived over with my folks over on Highway 87. Where the tanks are, it was the 3rd driveway past there. And I can remember that there was a 20-foot drift over the highway there, and it was closed for several days, and because they didn't have a rotary plow over here, they had to bring one from over the mountains to open it. And of course, we were without electricity, which with lighting, we had lanterns, so we weren't, that was not a problem. But we didn't have any water for the well, to pump the water. So Mom would give us kids dish pans, go get snow and bring in and melt it on the old cook stove and for water. And what else was it? That was. Oh yes, that's as far as we got from the house, was to get snow. And then when it finally let up, Dad got out. And he raised sheep and cattle. And there was several head of sheep that had gone under a hay rack. And he found them dead because they had suffocated under there. And so when it finally let up, he saddled our horses. And him and I drove. The cattle were up at about a mile away. and we went up there. He didn't worry too much about him because there was a lot of shelter up there for him. And we rode up there, and they were really glad to see us. We pulled hay out for him with our horses to feed him and that. And it was something to remember, upright.
Does anybody else have a story about the blizzard?
I've got a
Good.
Actually, it's a life story. She's a native Wyoming person. In '39, she was 4 years old, and they lived at one of the ranch houses on Rinch Ranch. And her sister decided that right in the middle, Decker was just about ready to become impassable. Her sister decided she wanted to be born. And
Talking to the little fuzzy thing.
yep. So they just barely got her to the hospital. What they did, the wife was there by herself in one of the ranch houses. And what they did is they lined somebody up to come and be with her, and it took that person about 5 hours. So a 4-year-old was all by herself in a house with all the blizzard going.
Oh my gosh.
Okay.
Anybody else? Okay.
There were just
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for sharing your stories. Appreciate it.